It's great to be here. We get the chance this morning to start a new series. The series is called Come to the Table. We have a fancy little logo. It all looks very nice. I'm really excited about this. I think this is a chance for us to reflect on something that we're growing in as a fellowship, something I think God's been speaking to us about through the book of Acts, but also beyond that. And there's a chance for us to think about how we actually live in the midst of this. This is a little loud. If we can turn it down, it's just rattling a little bit. So, what is our series going to be about? Lots of eating, lots of drinking, all those good things. The table. We're going to look through Scripture at a number of different passages. We've got about 6 weeks, roughly, that we're going to go through here. We're going to look in the Old Testament today at what hospitality is. We're going to look at what it means to sit and eat a meal with others in the presence of God. We're going to have a look at how Jesus interacted with people around tables. We're going to have a think about what the early church did. And we're going to do some of that with some themes. So some of the things that are going to come out are about humility, about our own sense of cost and giving of ourselves to others. We're going to think about whose table is it anyway. We're going to talk about what it means to invite someone not only into our space, but also into our lives. And the question is, why does all of this matter? And I want to say there are two practices that we have as a church that we've committed to together that I think this really influences. So the first is this, that we say we will share our lives with one another. We'll celebrate our faith together. We will eat meals together. We will have fun and laugh together. This is partly what it is to offer and receive hospitality. What it means to belong to this church is that we will share our lives. And we recognize that the table is part of that. We will welcome all is another of our practices. And it doesn't just say we will welcome all, but it says we will welcome all and do all we can to help others to trust and follow Jesus. We recognize that our welcome is about bringing people to Jesus. And I promise you, the table is the most helpful thing for that, which I hope we will see. But as we're going to talk about hospitality and we're going to talk about eating meals together and sharing life together, I also want us to recognize that the one thing that Jesus commanded the church to do together when it gathers is communion, or Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or whatever language you want to use. But not whatever language you want to use, because actually one of the things we're going to look at over the course of the next little while is that while different church traditions call this table something different, they all have something to offer to us. So our friends and our more liturgical friends would often refer to communion as Eucharist. That comes from the word Eucharisto, which is the Greek word for thanksgiving. Others refer to it as the Lord's Supper. That's a classically Scottish placed word to use in the Presbyterian tradition. And then those of us in the low church have often just called it communion. But actually, I think there are three things that are clear here that we're going to keep coming back to over and over. Eucharist, thanksgiving. That's about our posture as we come to the table. How do we come? We come with thanksgiving. The Lord's Supper recognizes to whom it belongs. It is His table. It's not my table as the leader of this church. It's not a priest's table. It doesn't even just belong to the church. This is the Lord's table. It's His place. And the final one is communion. So if we know already who it belongs to, and we know something of our posture is supposed to be thanksgiving, then communion is what we're doing. We're communing with one another. It's a very human thing to do, to take something, put it in your mouth and eat or drink. But also we recognize that we're communing with God in this space. That's what we're doing. So we're going to hold on to the language of all three of those throughout this series, and I hope beyond that, we're going to take Eucharist every Sunday through this series as part of our practical working out of this. I've got a talk in a few weeks that I'm going to do about communion as a theatrical act, as well as a very profoundly human base level act. And we're going to do that every week. In a moment, we'll get into a text. This morning's text is Genesis chapter 18, and we'll read it together in a moment. But I want to say a few things. No, actually, I'm going to read it first. I've changed my mind. Let's just do that. We're going to read together. If you've got your Bibles, it's Genesis chapter 18. We're going to read from verse 1. This is a story of Abraham. Abraham has already encountered the Lord a number of times. And it says this here: the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, where he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord. Do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent." Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." The word of God. And then I want to read again to us just one single verse from the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 13. It's this interesting chapter at the end of the book of Hebrews, which has been really concerned with a lot of theology, and this last chapter is really very, very practical. How do we live? "Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." We'll get into the text itself and a few things that we can see from the text, but I want us to think first of all about this general aspect of hospitality that we see Abraham offering. Henri Nouwen, who's one of my favorite writers in spiritual spaces, says this: "If there is any concept worth restoring to its original depth and evocative potential, it is the concept of hospitality." Today's text is going to be really our only text in this series that looks at the concept of hospitality as a whole. All the others are going to look at quite specific aspects of it. So I want to say a few words. And it is a few words. I spent about an hour and a half this morning hacking things out of this sermon because I realized it was actually not so much a sermon or indeed even a series, but probably about 35 hours worth of lectures, none of which anybody signed up for. So I want to make some observations about hospitality in general before we jump into the text. So the first is this: that every table, every act of hospitality, every welcome into a home in history has been culturally bounded. What do I mean by that? I mean that culture massively influences how we behave at the table. And that's okay. It's entirely okay. So if you've traveled around the world, I'm sure anywhere other outside of Scotland, then you will have experienced hospitality in very different ways. From as simple as when we first moved to Canada, when we went to someone's home, we learned that the first thing you do when you go in a home is what? Take your shoes off. Take your shoes off. Now, why would you do that? Well, because it's snowy. You know, trail snow. We don't do that here so much. Lots of people, I mean, we do it in our house and people think we're weird. We've got wooden floors. It doesn't really matter. But when we go in the house, we take our shoes off. It was a culturally bounded thing. It's just what we do. You travel other parts of the world. You go in to eat together and you sit on the floor. Other spaces that you have to go, you have to make sure that you're eating with your hands, but only your right hand. All sorts of other things that go on. But even in our own homes, we will have habits and cultures at the table that are different. So I was chatting with a guy that's a church planter in one of Scotland's most deprived communities. And I was talking about the power of hospitality, the power of sharing a meal. And he said, yeah, it's nonsense. It doesn't work in my community. I'm like, what do you mean? And he said, the people I work with, none of them have ever sat at a table to eat a meal. The idea that they would have a conversation over a meal is crazy because they sit and watch the telly. And that's what they do. And so his accusation to me was that my commitment to hospitality was actually a middle class thing, which hurt. I don't think he's right, but I do want to pause and recognize that every community, every home has its own cultural conditions around which hospitality happens. If you come to our house for food, you'll likely not know what time it is. We deliberately do not have a clock in the space we eat because we don't want people looking at the clock wondering what time it is. It's the simplest thing we've ever done, but it's one of the smartest things we've ever done. It does mean occasionally when you want to get rid of people, it can be a bit difficult, but we've never had anyone in our home that we wanted to get rid of, so it's only a theoretical problem. Every house looks different. But then what we need to do is bring the gospel to that. So as much as these are just things that happen, they're not good or bad necessarily, but we bring the gospel to that and we say, well, what does the gospel have to say to these things? What does the gospel have to say about how we are doing hospitality? Because I think Christian hospitality is different, or at least its motivations are different to the kinds of things that we see in cultures across not only Scotland but around the world. So I want to make some statements about what it's not and some statements about what it is. And I'm not going to defend these particularly because otherwise that's the 35-hour lecture that none of you signed up for. So the first is that Christian hospitality is not reciprocal. So I do not offer hospitality to someone because they will give me something back. This is one of the classic things that we'll see when Jesus comes on the scene here. Because actually there was a culture back then of if you invited someone for dinner, you were doing it because they could do something for you. You would give them the place of honor, and they would then be able to bring something to you. We don't do that. We don't do hospitality in order to get something from someone else. We do it because we do it. The one that goes back to my church planter friend in his deprived community is this: Christian hospitality is not entertainment. We're going to run some classes, I think. It's all right. These things happen to us all. Well done, Bill. What are we getting? Is that a story? Bill's fighting with it too. Are we done? That's all right. It's good. Well done. Christian hospitality is not about entertainment. This isn't about can you host a fancy dinner party. This isn't about can you cook really well. Listen, I love to do that. It's one of my favorite things to do is to cook my best meal, have people round, sit at the table and do that. But that's frankly my hobby. That is not Christian hospitality. That's just having my friends round or people we'd like to get to know and eating good food and enjoying the good things of God. It's a good thing to do. It's not a bad thing. But it's not the same as hospitality. Christian hospitality is also not about social status. This is really important. Because if it's something about social status, then it matters what kind of home you have. It matters what kind of space you have. Actually, my friend in Dundee, his statement is true because actually you can offer Christian hospitality in a home that doesn't have a table. You can offer Christian hospitality in a home that has no food to serve. Because you can provide a place of welcome, a place of safety, a place of refuge, a place of belonging. This is not about social status or what you have or have not got. Christian hospitality is about something different. Christian hospitality is about the love of the other. That the person you have in your home receives genuine love from you. That is what Christian hospitality is. It is about the community that it creates around the table. There's a woman named Margaret Visser who, as far as I know, is not a woman of faith. She's a sociologist, and she's probably the foremost thinker on the kind of sociology of the table. She has a book, the best of her books, for those of you that might be interested in such a thing, is a book called The Rituals of Dinner, and she explores the habits of eating and community that are built in that. And she says this, that the most individual act that we can imagine, eating, right, that it's a profoundly individual act, is also the thing that can create deep community. If you sit at a table and eat with people, and we're going to talk about this in a few weeks' time in particular, it's one of the most profoundly egalitarian things you can do. By egalitarian, I mean equalizing. Everyone's the same at the table. It doesn't matter if you're a king or a homeless person. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if you're from Southeast Asia or from Norway. I don't know why I picked those two, but anyway. The reality is you sit at a table. Everyone sits at the same table, hopefully, and everyone therefore is equal. There is no head or bottom of the table. Everyone does the most profoundly basic thing, which is take food from a plate or from a serving thing and put it in their mouth and chew and eat and swallow. It is profoundly a space where people are equal. This is part of what we found in the ACT series, right? This question of how do we bring people together. We talked about this last week. Actually, the table is the space that this can happen. It's why the food rules were really key when they were talking about how is it that Jew and Gentile can be together. Why did they care so much about the kinds of food they were eating or what they could eat and couldn't eat? Well, because actually table fellowship was the place that that community was built. A couple of other things that Christian hospitality is alongside this. Christian hospitality is costly. It should cost us something in time, in energy, in our physical space, in money sometimes. We've had the privilege over the years of having some people come and live with us for a period of time. I'm sure many of you have too. And it is a genuine joy to do that. Genuinely brilliant to have new people come and live in your home, often in times of crisis or times of transition or whatever it happens to be. But there's a cost to it because other people come into your space and they disrupt your life. They do things differently than you do. They don't quite put the dishes in the dishwasher the way that you put the dishes in the dishwasher because there is a right and a wrong way. They don't fold the towels the same. They don't do their laundry at the same time as you think is reasonable. And so they put the washing machine on at ungodly hours of the evening. Or any other number of things that you suddenly realize bug the life out of you but there's no good reason that they do so. Christian hospitality is costly. But I also want to tell you it's a command. 1 Peter 4, Romans 12, Titus 1, all verses will come to over the course of time. We are supposed to do this. It's not an optional extra. It's not for the gifted. Don't think there is a spiritual gift of hospitality. That's a somewhat controversial statement, but I don't think that there is. I think we're all supposed to do it. And as much, though, as I say it's not a spiritual gift, I do think some people are naturally more inclined this way than others and find it easier and they find greater joy in doing it. However, Christian hospitality can be learned. Let me put this quote up. This is from a woman named Christine Pohl, who has written a spectacular book called Making Room, The Rediscovery of Christian Hospitality, which is, again, for those of you who might be interested, another very good book to read. This is what she says. We become proficient in a skill by performing it regularly and by learning from persons who are masters of it. Hospitality is a skill and a gift, but it's also a practice which flourishes as multiple skills are developed, as particular commitments and values are nurtured, and as certain settings are cultivated. Friends, we can learn to do this. One of the greatest joys of my life recently has been that somebody new came to our church, and they said when I asked, why are you staying, which is a bit of a strange thing to say to somebody who decided to stay, but they said, because people have been hospitable to us. They've welcomed us really well. And this isn't to criticize previously, but I don't think that was a core part of our culture in the past as a church. And I could give you some examples of how that was true. It was individuals did things, but I don't think it was our church culture. And I think it has become our church culture because we have learned from one another, because we've extended ourselves to do that. These are all some of the things that I think are important as we think about what Christian hospitality is and it isn't. And we will come back to these over the course of the next 6-7 weeks. Turn to our passage in Genesis 18, and I want to make 3 quick observations about it that I think teach us something of hospitality, 2 from our Genesis 18 passage and 1 from Hebrews 13, which I think reflects on that same passage. Just as a general note, though, this passage is what's called a theophany. So it's an appearance of God in the Old Testament in human form. And most likely this is what's called a Christophany, so it's an appearance, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. Okay? If that's pickle in your brain, just forget about it. It doesn't really matter, but it's just to explain what's going on here. So we most likely have 2 angels and God is the 3 people that appear. If you're interested, my lovely wife actually preached a sermon on this passage about 2 summers ago when we did our Seeing is Believing series, where we preached on pieces of art. Does anybody remember that series? There's a few nods. So there's a piece of art. It's an icon by a guy called Rublev. It's called The Trinity. And that was one of the pieces. It's on the website. If you're interested, you can go and look at that. And that's the reflection on who these 3 people are. So we've got pre-incarnate Christ, 2 angels, and Abraham recognizes that this is who it is. This is what we're told right at the beginning of that passage. It says, the Lord appeared to Abraham. And so he has this sense of knowing who it is. On the hospitality he offers, first of all, we notice it's offered quickly. Verses 2, 6, and 8 either mention quick or hurry. He does it instantly. And this is often necessary. I think it's a really helpful thing to think about with hospitality, because I said earlier, hospitality is not entertainment. Right? Entertainment is something we plan for. I have a note of a couple of people in the church we need to have dinner with. I'm going to speak to them after the church and say, would you like to come for dinner? Here are some dates. They're in February. No, they're not quite like that, but but it's like we make plans and we organize, and it's something we do. That feels a bit like entertainment. It's got a hospitality bit to it. It's about welcome, safe space, nice food, all of that kind of thing. But it's about entertainment. Hospitality is often immediate and necessary for any number of reasons. In this case, it's because it looks like there's some sojourners or pilgrims passing through. They need somewhere to clean themselves up, to rest, to be refreshed. Sometimes we'll get people like that come through the church who just need a meal and sent on their way. Other times there will be people around who need somewhere to stay. Can we do that? And as a result, this kind of hospitality is often disruptive and costly because we haven't planned for it. We haven't organized our schedules around it. Many of the people, including people in our own church who have welcomed folks from the Ukraine, have recognized that this can't be planned for in a sense. There's an immediacy that's required. We have people who need a home to stay in now, and so we have to do that. People who work in the adoption and fostering spaces, exactly the same thing. Often there's an emergency that needs a child placed somewhere. What do? Well, actually, you turn your lives upside down. There's a disruption that comes to it. You make space where there was no space. This is what Abraham does. He hadn't planned to slaughter the best of the herd. He hadn't planned for bread to be made, for Sarah to get baking. They didn't have it just bubbling away in the background. Oh, there might be these people that come round this evening. Make sure you've got some nice bread on the go. No, they went and they ran and they did it there and then. We need to keep our eyes open, friends, for opportunities to offer this kind of disruptive hospitality, disruptive to us, where we can say, actually, we weren't planned for this, but you know what? Let's just do it. That's the first thing. Second thing, offering hospitality brings a blessing. And we've got to always get nervous when we walk into this territory in church, right? We're not a health, wealth, and prosperity thing. We don't believe God is some big jukebox in the sky that if you press the right buttons, you get the right tune out of him. But, I think it seems impossible to read the scriptures and not see that where we offer hospitality, the consequence is blessing. Now, I also want to say that's not the motivation for doing the hospitality, right? The motivation is Christian love. We know that hospitality is required. We know it's a command of God. We know that people are to be loved, and so we do these things. But the blessing comes. In this context, the blessing is a child. If you've got your Bibles, you can open them to Matthew chapter 25. This is Jesus, one of his discourses before his death in Jerusalem. He says this: when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. The king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." If I could paraphrase it, the Lord says to those on his right, come into your heavenly, eternal inheritance. A blessing for you because you offered me hospitality. There's a blessing from offering hospitality, I think an eternal one. This passage is deeply discomforting for any who reads it. And if you're not discomforted by reading it, then you're not reading it properly. We should expect a blessing as we go about doing the work of the Lord in hospitality. And while it's not at all our primary motivation, it should be part of our thinking. Finally, the little verses that I read in Hebrews 13, reflecting on this Genesis passage, or at least, as the kids say, riffing off of it, we see this sense of, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Now, there's something interesting going on here in the translation of this verse. This was another of the 35 hours that ended up on the cutting room floor. So if you're interested, I could run a whole seminar one evening about hospitality and bore you for hours about it, or entertain you for hours if that's the kind of thing you're into. But the word that's used here for hospitality to strangers is the Greek word philoxenia, right? Some of you will know this already, but so comes from philo, love, right? We know this is one of the kind of Greek forms of love. And xenia means stranger. So hospitality in Greek literally means love of stranger, or love to stranger. That's why we have love to stranger here. But I want us to be careful to read this properly. Because hospitality, Christian hospitality, is also bounded. Okay? So to offer hospitality is to take risk, to put yourself out there, to disrupt your lives, for it to be costly. All of those things are true. But I also want you to understand that this is not about leaving the building here today and finding any old person you can find on the street and having them come into your home. I don't think that's what this passage is talking about. And here's why. Because the first verse immediately before that says, keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. This is a message to the church. And the verse immediately after it says this, continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. This is talking about the church. Now, this is not to say we shouldn't offer hospitality out with the church. We should. It's a great witness. But our primary responsibility, and the kind of strangers that are envisaged here in Hebrews, are other Christians, people you don't know. There was an underground network of hospitality that caused the gospel to spread across the known world. That's how it happened. Traveling preachers would go along, they would hear about a Christian in a town, and they would turn up and they would be offered hospitality, and they would stay there, and then they would move on to where they were going. Exactly 19 years ago today, Karen's making a face because I haven't told her this story. Well, she knows this story because she's part of the story, but she doesn't remember what it is. October 2003, this weekend is Canadian Thanksgiving. And in October 2003, Karen and I had gone on holiday to Vancouver to discern with the Lord whether we should move there. That was the reason we went. We were very worthy about it. Anyway, it's a whole other story. We went on a trip out to Kelowna, which is a town about 3 hours east of Vancouver, in the kind of foothills of the Rockies, and it's a beautiful area, vineyards and all sorts of stuff. Beautiful place. But it's really set up for the summer. So we arrived in October, and frankly, there wasn't a lot there. It was going to be a bit dull, and we were partly there because we knew some people involved with a church that we were going to go visit on the Sunday. It turned out to be a really profound, significant moment on the Sunday. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is this. On the Saturday evening, we did a wild, crazy thing. We went to this bookshop called Chapters, which is, if you imagine, a massive Waterstones, and they had a coffee shop in it, and we spent our Saturday night sitting in Chapters having a cup of coffee. Crazy people that we were. We then get a tap on the shoulder from someone who says, "Glenn, is that you?" And I look up and I see this vaguely familiar woman with tattoos and ginger hair. And I'm like, oh, I've met you somewhere before. Now, I'll remind you, I wasn't always a Christian. And so I was really nervous for a moment, going, I have no idea who you are. And then thankfully, Karen went, Tanya! And I was like, I still don't know who Tanya is, but we'll go with it. It turns out that about 8 years before that, no, it can't be that far, 6 years before that, Tanya had lived in Aberdeen for a while and had come to the church that we were going to. She was dating my best man. That didn't work out. She'd gone back to Canada. And she's like, what are you doing here? We tell her what we're doing. And she's like, what are you doing tomorrow for Canadian Thanksgiving? And I'm like, I don't even know what Canadian Thanksgiving is. It explained why nothing was open in Kelowna as well, because it's like the whole world shuts down for it. She says, you must come to my parents' house. And we're like, well, we can't do that. And they're like, no, they'd love to have you. You can come to their house. It'd be great. We're all going to be there. The whole family will be there. It'll be brilliant. And I'm hearing all that. I can't. And we desperately tried to say no, but she wasn't having it. Here's the address. Turn up here tomorrow. We'll see you then. So we go and we turn up, and the story's quite funny. Those of you who know me know I am, in fact, I'm not even just not a dog lover. I hate dogs with a deep, deep passion. So I chose Portobello to live in. That was dead sensible, right? But anyway, we turn up, and without a word of a lie, the biggest dog you have ever seen in your life greets us at the door. It was not so much a dog as a horse, right? It's a Great Dane, and it was, like in my nightmare, my remembrances, it's bigger than me. Like it was truly enormous. I was like freaked out beyond belief. Like you could have fed the whole of Edinburgh with the thing if you just but it was awful. But these people brought us into their home, and they fed us. And they put their dog in another room. Hallelujah. We were strangers to them. We'd known Tanya a little, but we were strangers to them. And yet they expressed hospitality to us in a way that was an unbelievable blessing. But we did so not as complete strangers, because we were brothers and sisters. And we experienced something of the welcome of the Lord. And we had much in common at the table, even although they were some of the richest people I'd ever met in my life, who had a house that looked over the... It was astonishing. And did I tell you they had a massive dog too? There is boundaries to hospitality, which is important for us, because otherwise we would go crazy, right? You forget just walking down Portobello House. If you walked along Princes Street, you would be broken, because you would not know what you're supposed to do with this. And I am not for 1 minute saying we shouldn't care or do something about those problems of homelessness and brokenness that exist there. But I don't think it falls in our category today of hospitality in the same way, or at least what the New Testament envisages as this kind of hospitality. There are profoundly significant reasons why we should be involved there, and why we should support our brothers and sisters that are working in those spaces, and there are lots of them. But Christian hospitality has a boundary to it, and it provides us a safe space for that. I have a million other things to say. I'm not going to say them. If you would be genuinely interested in hearing more of this, because I've realized this is actually my thing. I'd love to talk more about this. So if anybody's interested, I will happily host a wee thing at our house with some food, and we'll talk about all the other bits and pieces, and I can even give you some papers I've written on it. They're not very good, but they are quite interesting. There's loads more to say, but Here's what I want us to take away. As we think about tables over the next number of weeks, I want us to recognize that this isn't just about us going to a table or coming to a table, but about us inviting others to our tables, bringing others to a place of recognition that they are welcome with us. I want us to recognize there is a blessing to be found there. There are human blessings that just happen because people gather together around the table. But there are other blessings that take place. Spiritual and eternal blessings that take place because we offer hospitality to others. But our motivation is not that blessing. It is because we have first been invited to God's table. A place that we arrive at recognizing His ownership. A table we come to with thanksgiving and where we commune together around it. And so today, as throughout this series, we will gather at the table together. And we're going to do a bunch of different things over the course of this 6 weeks. We're going to do communion in a very normal way today. We've got our little special holy trays with little special holy individual cups. And we've got pre-cut, very holy gluten-free bread that we will share together. Some weeks we're going to have others share it. Some weeks we're going to have you come to the front. Some weeks we may even just sit at big long tables and do something really different. But the reality is the table's the same. It's a place of welcome, open to all. All who would come seeking the Lord are welcome at this table. Something that Jesus enacted because He wanted His people to remember Him. It's so interesting to me that in all religions there are significant meals that tell the story of their faith. We can think of our Jewish friends and the meal of Passover. The Paschal meal tells of their past, of their present, and of their future hopes. It's a shame to me that they don't recognize that what Jesus was doing was saying, actually, I have fulfilled that story. But that's a sermon for another day. Let me read to us from the Gospel of Matthew again. I took my thing out. There we go. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He then gives them instructions. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when He had given thanks, He broke it and gave it to His disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then He took a cup, and when He had given thanks, He gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And so that which Jesus enacted, we join with brothers and sisters around the world today to participate in wine, or in actual fact juice, and in bread, not unleavened but gluten-free. And actually, those things matter. We don't use wine because we want all to be able to come to the table. We use gluten-free bread because we have people around our community who are gluten intolerant, and so we want all to be able to come to the table. Those little things express something of the hospitality of God to us and of our hospitality as a community to as many as we can make it open to. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for the beauty of Christian hospitality. But we thank you that it is rooted only in our recognition that you first came to us, that you first welcomed us. And so today we come to your table. We come to commune with you and with one another. And we come with thanksgiving.